now. Then go ahead and turn off your camera. And there is a chat feature in Zoom, so that should you have a question, I'll try to monitor the questions coming in the chat so that we can try to address questions. Like I said, though, this is not going to be the most ideal time for conversation, but we do want to make sure that we're clarifying anything that's presented if something is unclear. Okay, so let me start with a very, very brief orientation to why racial justice matters. Not going to get into all of the nitty gritties because we're making the assumption that folks, for the most part, are on board with the fact that racial justice is important work. But I'm going to highlight just a few areas, statistics, and things that help us understand why, you know, an enduring kind of legacy of not just, you know, individual instances of racism, but systems and structures that have been designed a certain way continue to have negative effects for Black people and other people of color. So the first area I want to just point your attention to has to do with health and race. And so we see that, you know, American Indians and Alaskan Natives, African Americans, continue to have disproportionate burden of chronic illnesses, right? There are a whole host of reasons that researchers hypothesize contribute to that, but there are continued racial disparities that we see in health. Those racial disparities also persist in mental health, right? So the actual burden and experience of various mental illnesses like depression, African Americans, when they experience mental illnesses, those tend to be more chronic, more pervasive, persistent, and they tend to die more frequently because of mental illnesses. There's also this lack of access to mental health services that this slide points out. So compared to our white counterparts, African Americans and Hispanics have higher unmet needs for mental health treatment. Another area that we see remains just kind of an ongoing reminder of issues around racial inequities has to do with the education system. And so in this slide, it just points out that Black boys and girls are far more likely to be suspended in schools because of behaviors than are their white counterparts, right? And so there's all sorts of researchers who do work in this area to help us understand why that might be. But even in our education system, we see just a continued legacy of inequity. And then so also in the criminal justice system, and we see inequities in the criminal justice system in a variety of ways. This slide here just points out racial disparities in arrests, right? And how we see that disparity growing over time, right? Not necessarily reducing over time, which you would hope that in a nation like ours, with all the resources that we have and education and things, that we would see some things start to get better over time. But that this slide points out, at least as far as arrests, we still see African Americans being arrested far more often than their white counterparts, and that's increasing over time. So those slides just highlight a few of the areas, a few of the reasons why folks who are concerned about, passionate about pursuing racial justice do so, because the implications of things staying the way they are detrimental to Black and brown folks. So now, we're going to transition just a bit into talking about the biblical perspectives of justice. So Dr. Costello, come on up.
Yes. Okay. So the question posed to us at the beginning of this is, why does justice matter? And I think that when we look at God's word, he really imparts on us a sense of justice, right? Because our God is a God of justice. The rock, his work is perfect, for all his ways are justice, a God of faithfulness and without inequity, just and upright. Righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. Steadfast love, faithfulness goes before you. He gives us a mandate to do justice. In Psalm 82:3, give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. In Isaiah He tells us, learn to do good, seek justice, correct oppression, bring justice to the fatherless, and please the widow's cause. In Micah 6:8, he tells us, he has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God. So a reminder, our God does not tolerate injustice, partiality, or corruption. And that comes to us from 2 Chronicles 19:7. I just want to say that verse again. God does not tolerate injustice, partiality, or corruption. And a reminder to us in Matthew 25:40. And the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you did to me. So God's reminding us that how we treat the least in our society, we really are treating him that way. So I think that we have a really solid biblical foundation. And I would challenge us to even consider it a mandate to do justice.
Thank you. Okay, so great foundation, as far as statistics and the evidence that we know from research, but then from a biblical perspective, which is CBU, we are, unapologetically Christian, is just the evidence is overwhelming. God's heart for justice, and that it's a mandate. So now let's get into a little bit of the technicals, okay? So all I'm going to do now is present out some various levels of engagement. Now, this is particularly relevant for non-Black people, okay? So as we're thinking about, things like Black Lives Matter and, different struggles that often the narrative is that it's the struggle of people of color or Black people is our struggle. I want to kind of present to you a counter narrative and give particularly non-Black people some ideas around how it is you can engage in racial justice work, what those levels look like. And so at the end of the presentation, you'll have an opportunity to do some reflective work, some action planning. We social work instructors, so you're not going to leave about this class without actually, moving into an action phase. So as I present this information, you might want to take notes and think about where you see yourself positioned in each one of these areas, okay? So the first level engagement is the actor. So the actor, you will think of someone who's more like a spectator in a game, okay? So their actions don't necessarily disrupt the status quo. There's not really a trying to correct racism, For this person, I imagine you're not on the part of participating in racist acts, but you're not disrupting it either, right? And quite honestly, for many folks, this position is, a place to start, because I'll be honest, I prefer you to be an actor than to be on the opposite end of the spectrum of folks who are participating in racist action, okay? So, but this person is a spectator, not necessarily challenging white supremacy in individual instances, one-on-one, or as a collective, right? This is the actor. The other, as we move along the spectrum, in the middle here, you see the ally, right? And some of you may have heard this term used before, right? An ally for racial justice. You see that term used, sometimes used incorrectly, but the term ally is really a verb. It's an action word. It's not necessarily a label one can give themselves or, subscribe to. So you wouldn't want to, introduce yourself as, I'm an ally for racial justice. Not necessarily, right? Like being an ally is something that you would have to do and act out. This is the person who's more likely to challenge racism. And so an example could be, the person where you're at the dinner party or you're at the social event and someone makes one of those off the cuff racial jokes, right? Or a racial stereotype. This person would be more comfortable saying, you know what? I don't know what made you think that was okay, but that was inappropriate, right? The person who is more likely to disrupt those spaces, those white spaces by, you know, kind of educating and correcting. So you see the image here, the person who's like, wait a minute, you know, so this is the ally, right? And the ally is very important to folks like myself, to people of color, to know that in the spaces that you are privileged to enter into, because there are many spaces that non-Black and white people will have access to that persons of color would never, that person as an ally, without any, you know, Black, you know, people around to see it happen necessarily, would be comfortable in challenging, disrupting those spaces, right? To make it very clear, you know, no, actually not all white people think that way, right? I don't think that way. I don't think that that's appropriate. So that's the ally. So you might want to think about, if you have yet felt comfortable, have seen yourself move from an actor to an ally, the idea is that throughout your life, as you develop into this work, that you'll be able to progress. But that's what the ally looks like. Now, the next stage, it's what's kind of, I guess, considered the ideal, right, arrival, and that is the accomplice. So moving from an ally to accomplice, an accomplice looks a little different. An accomplice is the one that's directly challenging institutional racism and white supremacy. So first, you have to be at a place of being able to recognize it when you see it, but challenging it at an institutional level. This has to do with blocking, trying to dismantle, voting against, not supporting racist people or policies, right? So, you know, not being able to be part of an organization that you know their policies are racist, speaking out against, voting against, right? Participating in ways that demonstrate an active, going against racist people at an individual level and policies. An accomplice has taken on, more than just the things that they do, has taken on or internalized this idea that not acting is not an option, right? That being complicit is also an action, and being complicit or being silent is an act against racial justice, right? So this person is totally sold on the fact that not working against it is not an option. Retreat is not an option. Another really key aspect of the person who's moved into this stage of being an accomplice really has to do with the image that you're seeing here on the slide, that sees our freedoms as bound together. That if Black people are not free, then I am not free, right? That we are joined in this thing together, because something about this idea of freedom and liberty, it is only preserved when everyone can access it or enjoy it, right? So that your persecution, like I take that personally, your persecution and the fact that you can't be free in this country is an affront to my liberty in this country, right? So seeing us as bound together in it. Someone who's an accomplice is able to be an active listener to the stories and experiences of people of color, and is really committed to building authentic and trusting relationships with people of color, right? So that's essentially the spectrum, from actor to ally to accomplice. And so that gives you an idea of the different kind of phases or stages that folks might be in. And there's really no pressure or expectation that, you know, if you're a certain age, you should be at a certain place, and, you know, because of your career and whatever, right? What we wanted to do in this time is make sure folks had a space to be honest with themselves about kind of where you fall, and then be able to gain some tips about how you might be able to move to the next stage should you choose to. So those are the three categories: actor, ally, and accomplice. Okay, I'm sorry about this image. I actually linked the website that this came from. It was an artist and a social rights activist that created this, that helps break it down visually on what this looks like. So here you see a person of color. The cloud is oppression. So as a person of color, I'm walking around in the world with like getting rained on with oppression every day. That's the experience. The ally says, I have an umbrella. I'll walk alongside you so you don't get so wet. Now, I appreciate that, right? I'd appreciate the ally versus the person that just stands there, right, watches me getting soaked. But the accomplice says, let's shoot a rocket in that rain cloud. right? Why is there a cloud of oppression over your head? That's not okay. So there's the difference that you see there, right? So the ally, the actor would stand and say, I'm not going to intervene. I see you getting soaked, but I'm not going to intervene. The ally says, let me help you manage, deal with, let me comfort you in your oppression. But the accomplice says, let's destroy the cloud that's creating the oppression. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense by seeing that visual. All right, Miss Jennifer.
Okay, so now we want to take you through a conversation around some principles, some basic principles for partnership. Can you click for me, Kristen?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, so we're going to talk about these 5 principles.
Sorry.
The first one, the first step is, it starts with a self-examination of your own heart. Second principle is that you have to be in relationship with people that don't look like you, who don't share your race, your culture, your identity. This concept of seeking out knowledge and that learning is an ongoing process. We have to be willing to get uncomfortable, right? We have to be willing to get to an uncomfortable spot. And then we have to figure out, what does it mean to take action? So I want to start with looking at the first principle of examining your own heart. So when we think about self-reflection, I think it's important for us to start from a place where we acknowledge that we all have biases and prejudices, right? We are in our hearts, we all have these things. We all have blind spots that we can't see. And the reason that I know that we have blind spots is that God tells us that we do. In Psalms 139, 24, and 25, he encourages, the author says, search me, God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts. See if there's any offensive way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. In Psalm 19, the author says, who can understand his errors? Cleanse me of my secret faults. Keep back your servant from willful sins. Let them not have dominion over me. Then I shall be blameless, and I shall be innocent of great transgression. In Job, how many wrongs and sins have I committed? Show me my offenses and my sins. And I love Matthew 7, 1 through 5. Judge not, that you not be judged. For with what judgment you judge, you will be judged. And with the measure you used, it will be measured back to you. And why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye, but you do not consider the plank in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me remove your speck, and look at the plank that you have in your own eye? Hypocrite. First remove the plank from your own eye, and then you will clearly see to remove the speck from your brother's eye. It's so easy for us to focus on the other person and maybe what they have done wrong or their shortcomings, right? The speck in their eye. The visual I get from this, right, is I have a 2x4 out of my eye, and every time I turn to the right, I hurt people. And every time I turn to the left, I'm hurting more people. But that's not where I want to start with. That's not where I want to focus, right? It's easier for me to focus on you and your speck than to really take that deep examination that God has called us to do in his word about our own hearts, our own beliefs, our own values, our own transgressions, the way that we may have hurt people. Even if it's inadvertently, it still has happened. So second is that relationships matter. Relationships matter. So I would just encourage us all to think about who is in your circle of friends and who might be missing. Are you open to developing healthy, trusting relationships with people of color? We know that Jesus ranks relationships with God first, his first priority, right? and then to others. Our crosses goes up and it goes across. So in Matthew, 22, 37 through 40. We see in scripture here where God really calls us to be in relationship with others. The other thing that I would encourage us to do is, do you have a spiritual mentor in your life who can speak truth and correction? Jesus is our ultimate mentor. We seek him first, and we also need other people in our lives that out of love will help us and correct us. So in Ecclesiastes 4:9 through 10, two are better than one because they have a good return on their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. In Proverbs, we learned that iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another. And in Romans 15:14, I myself am convinced, my brothers and sisters, that you yourselves are full of goodness, filled with knowledge, and competent to instruct one another. So God calls us to mentor each other and to instruct each other and to be in relationship with each other. So the next principle that we have is seeking knowledge. So are you engaged in the study of God's word, and are you acting according to what he has called you to do? He is the ultimate authority, and we are his beloved. He loves us so dearly. He will not misguide you in his word. Do your homework. Learning is an ongoing process. We have to keep seeking information and truths and finding the information around social injustices and what's happening in our society. We have to be willing to ask sincere, thoughtful questions. If you don't know, that's okay, but are you willing to learn? Are you willing to ask the hard questions? And are you open to hearing information that might be really hard for you to sit with, right? We can all read books, watch films. I would encourage you, if you need recommendations on sources to help you continue your own knowledge, that you ask a trusted, credible source for guidance. And be committed to that continued seeking knowledge. The last thing I want to encourage us to do is to get uncomfortable. So we need to listen more than we speak. We need to learn to be okay with not having the answers. It's important for us to validate other people's experiences. And we have to figure a way to manage our own discomfort, right? That guilt, shame, and fear that we have that may actually work as a barrier for us to kind of progressing through this spectrum that Dr. Hayes has shared with us. And we have to be willing to make mistakes and to be corrected. And I think that that's why it's so important for us to really analyze and take a look at who are those people in your life, right? Who are those people that are missing? Who are those people that you need to seek out information, that you need to listen to more, that you need to hear their stories, and that you're open to their correction.
Sorry, I forgot to mute myself. So now what we wanted to do, I think something special about Jennifer and I being able to present together is because, we've been able to develop a relationship with one another. And so I thought it might be nice to share some stories and examples, right? Especially as a Black woman, some things that I have seen her do that have helped me to know, like, oh, she's an ally or like she's an accomplice, right? I know we're in this thing together. So I'll share just a few things that come to mind. It was interesting. We actually had the opportunity to travel to Uganda together, which was a mind-blowing experience in so many ways. But while we were there, there was a moment that we had like some downtime. And so as we're kind of sitting, you know, in this parking lot before this event was to start, you know, she was just sharing with me like that this was one of the first times being in Uganda in her life. She felt like the other, you know, I mean, here we are in a country of all Black folks, and every space we walked into with her glowing golden hair and, you know, fair skin, she was seen. I mean, literally children would be, you know, running down the street to get a glimpse, and, you know, and how that was odd. And so in that moment, I felt closer to her in that moment, because she shared, I can't imagine what it must be like for you to kind of live this way, right? That you go to places where, you know, if you're in environments where you're the only Black person and there's no other Black people, you know, I can't imagine having to be this seen all the time, right? And I hadn't really thought about it in that way, because, you know, most Black folks, especially if you are privileged to be in spaces where, you know, you are the minority, especially those of us who move into higher education, you know, you're used to being the only Black person in the classroom, you're used to being the only Black person, you know, at your job and that sort of thing, that, you know, you kind of get used to that experience. And so it was an interesting moment between us that really only could have happened because we had developed a relationship. And I gotta be honest, those of my colleagues who know me, you can probably guess that it was her that really initiated the relationship development. Because I tend to be a little like, you know, stay in my bubble sort of thing. And so, you know, not really knowing me and what my deal was or whatever, you know, it was interesting that she had to intentionally make that decision. It's not, so one thing I want, you know, to be known, it's not something that's just going to happen, right? Like, I don't want you like, you know, poaching Black people to try to find a Black friend or anything like that. But, you know, you have to be open to actually seeking out relationships with people who are not like you, with people of color. And so we had been able to develop, you know, some level of trust before that experience even happened, so that she was able to feel vulnerable with me to share that. And for me, the experience was very validating, right? Very validating, her just having a glimpse into what it must be like for most Black people going through your day-to-day life. So that's one example, right, of that sort of building a trusting relationship, being in a space where you're willing to share stories with one another, and then being able to take the position of the other, right? To be able to imagine what must that be like. There's another example that, because we have developed a relationship and just kind of like sharing stories about life and things like that, you know, when a lot of the recent events happened with George Floyd, and, you know, a lot of us have been in conversation about that for me, this isn't really something new. You know, I didn't have to necessarily sit my kids down for the first time and explain to them these, you know, how the world works. And that just, I think it may have been last week or the week before, my husband, he likes to stay active, and, you know, he can't go to the gym anymore, so he likes to run. Well, he likes to run through Diamond Bar. And I don't know if you're familiar with these areas, but, you know, it's a suburb that is not, you know, predominantly Black. And so I did this whole interrogation of like, well, what were you wearing? And, you know, were you wearing that? Make sure you don't wear, you know, dark clothes. Make sure you look real sporty, right? Like, I want to wear like a headband and stuff, like look like you're going to run. Because I know the perception could be, you know, that he is a Black man running through the streets of this neighborhood where Black people shouldn't be. And if he doesn't look athletic enough, that something, you know, somebody could misinterpret his presence, right? And so that's something that happens on a regular basis, right, in my home, these sorts of conversations. And so when I had shared that, you know, with Jennifer, I was touched by her response. We had like another moment, touched by her response. And I don't want to put words in your mouth. What was your response? Share with the people.
Well, I just shared with my colleague that those aren't my experiences. that I don't worry about my husband or my sons going out running in their neighborhood. I've never one time thought or worried that somebody could drive up and gun them down because they're jogging in the street, right? That isn't my reality. I never spend a second of my day worrying about my son or my husband's safety or what they're wearing or, checking them out, right? What do you have on, right? That experience that she has, I cannot relate to, and I don't have to worry about those things. And so when she shares those personal stories and experiences with me, it helps me see the world from a different perspective, one that I don't have to share.
Yeah. So again, it's just kind of, we wanted to really emphasize, really harp on this piece about being in relationship, because this is not, I don't think that sort of story would have come up just, organically. And because I know that she was already in the position, like I already knew she was an ally, right? I already knew she was an ally. So that when these stories come up, it's easier to take on that perspective. And she knows my husband, right? And she knows my kids, right? And so that pain of like the worry that, my husband can't freely exercise in our neighborhood because he's Black, like now it takes it to another level, right? It takes it to another level for the non-Black person who's in relationship with a Black person who can feel the fear and the concern and all of that. So now that should become intolerable. So now I want to share one more story about when I kind of knew like, oh, she's an accomplice. Okay, I see what this is. There's actually a few, but one that was so, it just tickled me so. So we were at a conference together, and we were in this session, and I honestly can't even remember what the topic was or whatever, but whatever it was for this workshop, we were both interested in it. And so, it was, a white man that was presenting, and somehow throughout his presentation, like something he said, kind of perked up our radars, both of us. And it was something about, something to the effect that, that the church, hasn't really harmed people, and, we shouldn't have to apologize for things that have happened in the past, and, something to that effect. So that, I felt it. And then I kind of glanced over to her, and I could see she was, her body language was changing. So I was like, oh, okay. And so next thing I know, she's like, excuse me. It's, her little hand goes up. And she tries to correct this person. Now, he wasn't very receptive, but I mean, we walked out of that thing like he had cursed her mama. Like it was so, she was fuming, and it almost took me aback because, as a white woman, there was nothing that he said that was specifically offensive to her, right? It wasn't anything that was necessarily attacking to her person. But in that moment, I realized like that something that was wrong. This person had a position to be able to share their thoughts with an entire audience, right? And they used that opportunity to like reinforce these kind of, just ridiculous messages that she felt personally offended. And so that reminds me of that image where the two are handcuffed together, right? That any attacks to my freedoms, my liberty, my ability to, own my experience were attacked to hers. And so I was like, oh man. I've also seen, Jennifer, and I hope you can maybe kind of share some tidbits of how you do this. I've seen her in many situations use the privilege that she has and that she owns to be able to strategically buck against systems of white supremacy. So that's anywhere from the way that she conducts her classes. So I'm sure students of hers, you've seen her do this in the class, to even if there's an event that we're putting on or something, her being very mindful of like, wait a minute, there's too many white faces, right? Like, are the faces that are presenting reflective of the folks in the audience? And she will gladly take a step back, move to the side to allow someone else, to encourage someone else to take the spotlight, because she's very conscious of even the optics of this, white woman and what her presence signifies, right? So that's really important. Do you want to share anything about that? Like how you do that thing?
know, what my heart really wants to say right now is that your own journey for figuring out your, role and your part around social justice really has to, it's impacted by the people in your life that have corrected you and guided you along the way, right? Like, I'm old. And so what's true in my, lifespan is that I've had people who loved me enough to smack my hand, right? To guide, to correct, to help change and transform different views, different prejudices, different biases, that God is so good and kind and loving to me that he never leaves me as he's found me, right? And so when I think about, special people currently in my life who I am so thankful for and who help me in my own growth, Dr. Hayes, Dr. Mexico, Dr. Lee Johnson, who love me enough to speak truth and correction to me, and who I feel safe enough to go to and say, hey, can I connect with you about this? But without those people in our life that will help us in our journey and our growth, we don't get to kind of move across the spectrum. And so what I really want to encourage you today is, who is your Dr. Hayes? Who is your Dr. Lee Johnson? Who is your Dr. Mexico in your life that loves you enough to correct you and smack your hand out of love and help you continue in your growth journey?
Yeah, thanks for that. So those are a few kind of anecdotal stories. And the reason why I wanted to share them is because, I think sometimes white people, non-Black people in general, struggle with, at least this is what I hear, not knowing what to do, not wanting to make a mistake, not wanting to say the wrong thing. And granted, there's a lot of there's some truth to that, right? That there's this risk that you could offend and say the wrong thing. But what I found, and I'm sure what many of us find, even what the research suggests, is that folks that are in relationship with each other are more likely to give each other the benefit of the doubt, right? So and we have these when we were on campus, these pop into one another's office experiences all the time, where, I know my sister is doing her homework, right? She's not coming to me like, oh, well, how does this work for Black people? Because you can Google that, right? So she's doing her own homework, but she will come to me with so I'm picking up on a vibe. Tell me if I'm wrong, right? Am I off base? Does it seem did you notice? So we have those sorts of conversations all the time where she's honestly trying to perfect that radar. That's was something off about this? Am I not reading this right? Did I make a mistake by that sort of thing? And not that, I'm the expert of all things Blackness, but we can at least have these honest conversations about what our perceptions are and how it is that we can intentionally act to make change. So one of the last things I wanted to mention as we transition into this action phase period is that these things are have to be intentional, conscious, and have to become a part of who you are, not necessarily just something that you do. And so one of the reasons why I'm so thankful that kind of God revealed all of this whole thing to me when he did is because if history proves itself true, as soon as they open up them beaches and parks, ain't nobody gonna be protesting on those streets, and we're gonna be back to life as usual, right? If history shows itself to be true, the protest and the outrage will last for a little bit, and then we will have been desensitized to, kind of the murder and disenfranchisement and, oppression of Black and brown folks again until there's the next situation, right? Because I've seen this movie already. This is a rerun. We've played this movie several times, right? And people get outraged at the moment, and then we don't see lasting change. So you want to be a part of that lasting change. It really has to be an internal, this is the way I do life sort of work for all of us that we're in it together. So now, Ms. Jennifer, can you give us the instructions for this action phase.
Okay, everybody, so now it's your turn. You know, Dr. Hayes has shared with us the spectrum: actor, ally, and accomplice. So, you know, you're in a safe space where you can do a self-assessment. Where are you at on the spectrum? So I just want everybody to take a minute and think about this: actor, ally, accomplice, and where are you? Everybody have their place? Thumbs up. Okay, so next step, right? What are 2 or 3 things that you can do to move yourself to the next level, right? So if you identified as an actor, what are 2 or 3 things that you can start doing today that's going to move you to the ally? If you identify as an ally, what are 2 or 3 things that you can start doing today, implement in your life today, that are going to move you to the accomplice? And if you identify as an accomplice, what are 2 or 3 things that you're going to continue to engage in so that you remain there, So this is where, if you have, if you're willing to share, we'd love to hear your ideas in the chat box about what it is that you've come up with, just so that we can all benefit from that. And if you don't want to share, that's okay too. This is, you know, a time for some personal reflection, and that's okay if you just need to sit with it for a minute. But if you'd like to share, we would love to hear your ideas. What can you do? 2 or 3 things to move to the next level.
So don't unmute yourself or it might cause chaos. So, but
Yeah,
there's a chat feature.
Chat.
And some of you have found this chat feature already. So I have it pulled up. Those of you who do wish to share, I can, you can see what folks are suggesting there. But what are some specific things, that you feel like you can do? And like Dr. Costello said, if you're not at a place of sharing, and you might, I mean, this is potentially life-changing stuff for some folks. So if you need a minute to kind of digest it and kind of, you know, process it, that's perfectly okay too. But being social workers, you know, it's not enough just to have some conversations if it at some point doesn't move into an action plan, right? So we've just led you through. Hopefully we've engaged you. Now you have assessed yourself. Those, my social workers, you should know the next step. After assessment comes planning. So what's the plan? What's the plan? And then how can that plan be something that's, you know, specific and realistic, and you feel like you're in class all over again, right? So create yourself some a plan that you think that you can actually stick with.
Yes, Megan. What do I do next, right? You attend a couple of protests, but what's the next step? I love that you're thinking like that. So here's what I want to encourage you. Kristen, guide students, instructors on ways to support their peers and students. Yes. Okay, so this really is hard work. When you think about what are those action steps that you're going to put in place in your life, and that you're going to commit to, and that you're going to put in place starting today. What we know is that we can get better results if we have an accountability partner, right? Who is the person that you're going to share your action plan with that's going to help keep you accountable, that's going to help you continue this work, right? In 6 months from now, in 9 months from now, in 12 months from now, when we don't have this heightened attention to the issue, right? And it starts to dim down a little bit. How are we going to stay fully engaged in the work? And who's going to be your person that's going to hold you accountable and not let you forget? Not let you forget the plan that you put in place for your own growth and development in this area, and continue to move across the spectrum. Vote. Cecilia, yes, I'm high-fiving you, right? We all need to be actively engaged in our political system and vote.
That is so true. I took my kids down to our local protest. We didn't protest. I didn't feel like I was at the place to be able to engage in that level, right? Because, you know, you got to be honest with yourself about what you can handle at that moment. And so, you know, but we took our kids to go pass out snacks and waters to the protesters, right? Keep them hydrated while they're on the corners doing their protests. And you know, it was interesting because, you know, they all looked like they were very young and they're excited to do this. But as we were going away, I had to shout to them, like, don't just protest, you better vote too, right? So the mama in me is like, you better vote. I don't want to see you out here just protesting. You know, make November count if you really want to see some change happen. So definitely voting is important, and encouraging those that we know in our social circles to vote.
Yeah. You know, I just want to just commend Cecilia, right, for acknowledging that this is really hard work. And this work isn't going to, right, an hour with us today is like, we're on formula, right? We haven't even gotten to real baby food yet, right? Let alone real sustenance or nourishment or thoughts about how to really make some progress here. We're just opening a conversation because this is really, really hard work. And that's why it's really important for us to do this work together in community, accountability, partnership, relationally. That's how our God made us, and that's how he wants us to think about social justice and to engage in it together as a community.
So the last thing, I see these comments flooding in. Thank you, Dr. Iverson, for your comments. Apparently there is a nomination for Dr. Lee Johnson 2020. I don't know if that's going to pan out. We got a lot of stuff on his plate already, so we'll see.
You can't take him from us, Dr. Iverson. I'm sorry. We need him there.
But I do want to, so if you didn't get to see Dr. Iverson's comment, he says, you know, moving from ally to accomplice, long-term, lifelong narrative. Yes. So being mentored by people of color to grow in empathy and practical empowerment of historically oppressed people. So I got to be honest, there was a real purpose, not just because I like my sister Jennifer here, but I realized that there are certain things that white people and non-Black people need to say to other white people, right? And so that's why we wanted to do this thing together, so that those who are at a place of recognizing that they have some level of privilege, unearned, undeserved, just because of the world and society that we're born into, that there are areas in all of our everyday lives that we can begin to influence. And I think it's that lifelong commitment, the everyday work, once that stuff gets good down in you, you can't like unknow what you know, right? Like you'll get to a place, I feel like, where you can't ignore it with your children every time opportunity you have to like teach a lesson about something, or, in every party that you're in. And if you notice that, dang, all of my social circles are people that look just like me, either I need to do something to change these circles so that they're less exclusive, or maybe I need to join a book club or something, right? Like, just in your everyday lifelong work, how can you be an advocate for justice? So I see these comments rolling in. Thank you, thank you, thank you. It would be helpful to know the best terms to use and not to use. So terminology is something. Some of these things are fluid. We're used to that term by now, right? Fluid, that evolve over time. Some things that you used to be able to say, you can't say anymore. And the reality is that I feel like being in relationship with people who identify with certain groups, again, you'll create these trusting spaces where you can ask, like, does that sound right? Should I be, can I say that? And then you'll do it with something that feels more comfortable. You'll be more confident in your ability to do that. The last thing that I wanted to share with you all is just a list of resources. So this first one, whiteaccomplices.org, is where they have a graphic and really kind of breaks down step by step of what the actor, the ally, and the accomplice is. So there are resources there should you want to be able to pull those definitions out. They provided definitions for those things. And then that second link that you're seeing on your screen there, there's actually a handout, and the artist that drew that image with the, you know, umbrella holder and the oppression cloud and that. So you can consult the original website to get access to that image and the entire handout that really explains fairly well what that accomplice is, what that might look like for you. And then there are a couple of book suggestions that we've provided. Now, one of my top suggestions is White Fragility. Dr. Lee Johnson introduced this to our team. As a Black person, it like changed, you know, my view in my world in so many ways. Jennifer, I think you're reading it, yeah?
Yes.
Would you recommend?
Highly. Do not let the summer go by without reading the book, especially if you are a Caucasian person.
White Fragility, right? So I'd highly recommend that one. The New Jim Crow is one that speaks specifically to issues around the criminal justice system, so that if you're in a place of trying to understand or contextualize, I mean, we can see a video about, you know, with a man being choked out by a police officer, but to really kind of understand the full picture, it's best to get that historical institutional context so that we can start to think about these sorts of things at the institutional level, not like a bad apple sort of scenario. So that book does well on that one. Generous Justice is one that our program director introduced to us as well, I believe, or maybe, you know, the dean did. I'm not quite sure where it originally came from, but Generous Justice really goes into quite a bit of depth about what justice means biblically and God's mandate for justice. So very well done. For those of you who do profess to be Christian, are followers of Christ, or readers of the Bible, I think it just provides a context to, you know, God's heart around justice that I had not really thought about before that. Another text is The Color of Compromise. The Color of Compromise is really specific to the churches, right? The organization of the church's role in being complicit in racism historically, right? So that this is not something that's new, and how really those of us who consider ourselves part of the church, right? Part of the body of Christ, who belong to formal faith organizations, how it is that we should be at the forefront really of making a change, because we've often been complicit in allowing racism to continue. And for CBU students and faculty, I know for sure we have access to Right Now Media. It's like the Christian Netflix. So lots of video resources and materials, Bible studies, and they actually have a collection of justice related topics and studies for folks who really want to be able to see this justice work from that biblical perspective, with different experts talking about the work that they do and examples of how we can pursue justice from a church organizational standpoint. I think that's it. So I'm actually going to stop sharing my screen now. And I will thank you all formally, because I'm going to turn off the recording. And I want to be able to see your faces and like act a little rowdy and say hi without it being recorded. And then I'll give you a few